Welcome everybody, good morning. My name is Anastasia Smith and I am a clinician educator at Genova Diagnostics and also a registered nutritional therapist. Welcome to Genova's monthly case study group. If you haven't already attended one of our previous case studies, our intention really for these case study groups really is to facilitate more of a sort of practical based learning and to offer practitioners an insight into the presentation of varying clinical pictures in some of our most popular tests. And then, of course, the application of protocols and treatments based on test findings. So our point of focus will always be the use of popular tests such as the GI effect stool profile and also the metabolomics or NutriVal. And then, of course, some of the smaller test panels that may be supportive. Just so you know, I'm also joined today by Lenka Quintrell, who is another one of Genova Diagnostics clinician educators, and Lenka will be supporting me with monitoring the questions box. So if you have any questions with regards to the presentation or any issues at all, or any sort of questions around the tests that we offer, Lenka will help to support with the answers there. But there will be time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A regarding the case study itself. So today I will be presenting an interesting case study showing the presentation of symptoms of depression, IBS and urticaria on the GI effect stool profile, as well as the SIBO test. And there will be an intro into the case study first, of course, and then I will be diving into the test results and the therapeutic approaches that I employed. And then, of course, at the end, there will be a 15-minute Q&A, which, you know, of course, you can leave it until the end to ask your question, but I encourage you that, you know, if you have the question or the question comes to mind during the presentation, to at least write it in the question box when it comes to mind, so that you don't forget at the end, for example. So let's get started on the case study. So this client, a female 32-year-old, came to me earlier this year, predominantly for depression and anxiety that she had been experiencing from a young age, as well as IBS symptoms, which she claims to have been suffering with for as long as she can remember. In terms of the main IBS symptoms, it was mainly constipation, which she actually described as pellet-like movements, in addition to quite debilitating nausea, pain and cramping. She also had painful periods since the onset of her menses, which seemed to have a strong genetic component, as there was a significant family history of this on her mother's side. There was also some significant family history of depression on her father's side, so it seemed like genetics were influencing her current, presentation. The urticaria was described as severe hives all over her body, and she had been put on a permanent antihistamine, fexofenadine, for this, which she was on chronically, and she described that if she didn't take the pill for more than a few days, and she would start to itch, even at this point when she had come to see me. She didn't know what triggered the urticaria. The recent bout, or the most recent bout, was in the last 2 or 3 years, and there was no significant trigger that she could recall. It seemed to come out the blue. So delving into her health history, she reported to not have had any significant childhood issues, no frequent use of antibiotics, and she also was born vaginally, which, as you know, is quite an important detail when we're trying to figure out, especially issues with the immune system and also issues related to GI function. She tracked the worsening of her IBS symptoms over the last 2 years in particular, where she had experienced severe bouts of nausea, urticaria, and a worsening in general for IBS symptoms and depression. She believed that her IBS was either triggered or significantly worsened by her parents divorced 10 years ago. At the time, there was a lot of upheaval in her life. She said that she was moving from hostel to hostel, and so obviously was homeless and had no stable living circumstances for a period of time. And it was also at that time that she had the onset of her depression, which she was prescribed sertraline for, an SSRI, and she'd been on that on and off since then at 50 milligrams. Currently, she was taking sertraline a few times a week and increased the dose at times that she felt necessary. So it wasn't an everyday thing, but she felt like at times that she needed to increase the dose, and she did find that it did actually support her. In terms of the urticaria, there was no trigger that she could recall, as I mentioned before, and she was on the fexofenadine chronically, which kept the urticaria under control. So in terms of her diet, obviously very significant to go through. Her diet wasn't great, which I'm sure many of you, you know, when you're taking on a new client, if there's a lot that you can do with their diet, it's, you know, it's quite a positive thing in some way, because it also suggests that it can give you an insight into the potential for many of the symptoms to be potentially mediated, if not triggered, by someone's diet, if someone's eating a very poor diet. So as you can see, she frequently ate takeaway foods. Many of them were also fermented foods, like kimchi, for example. She really enjoyed kimchi, bibimbap, Japanese food, bean stews, Korean dishes, etc. She explained that she had identified a sensitivity to dairy, which she explained that, you know, if she had something like a milkshake, for example, she would have explosive stools. But she didn't actually fully avoid dairy, even considering this, so it wasn't a complete strict avoidance. She also ate a high amount of refined sugars and carbohydrates, so cakes on a daily basis, croissants, Nutella and cornflakes. She also had fizzy drinks in her day-to-day diet as well, Coke, milkshakes, Fanta, fruit juices. So a lot of changes that needed to be made. Try and change the slide. In terms of her lifestyle, one of the main struggles was her job circumstances. She was in a job that she didn't enjoy. Part of her work meant spending many hours in front of the computer sat down, and partly as a consequence, she was very inactive. She said that she had only recently resumed Pilates, but prior to that, she was very inactive. Her main enjoyments were hanging out with friends, watching Korean dramas, being in the countryside, online browsing, and unfortunately, her sleep wasn't great, which is also massive in consideration of symptoms of depression, IBS as well, of course. She was a light sleeper. She also found it in particular difficulty. She had difficulty in getting to sleep. So my initial recommendations, based on the fact that her diet was, you know, obviously high in sugars and processed foods, and the likely impact that this was having on her brain and her mood, as well as potential dysbiosis in the gut, I had her increase her protein levels significantly to around 20 to 25 grams of protein in each meal, and replace simple carbs with complex carbs, as well as diversifying and increasing her plant fibers. I offered some sweet alternatives, of course, where I'm not going to expect that someone goes completely cold turkey on sweets, you know, and or something alternative to the types of sweets that she was having. And so I supported her with some healthier alternatives. The fizzy drinks were replaced with sparkling water flavored with mint and cucumber, or lemon and strawberries, depending on what she liked. I should mention that there was, you know, initially quite a big hurdle to get over in terms of education around things like the difference between simple and complex carbs, what was fiber, and education around ingredients to avoid in food. So there was a lot of effort put into that initial, those initial changes to really educate her in making healthier choices. The supplements, so I very rarely in initial consultations will recommend supplements unless I can see like a symptom is screaming out to me that something needs some support initially. I normally wait for test results to come back, and you know, then I'll recommend specific supplements. But I did offer her a tincture with some ginger and bitters for the nausea. just to support her with that, take the edge off of that at least initially. And then, of course, I recommended that she did the GI effect stool profile. I also, after the GI effects, she ended up doing the SIBO, which we'll go through. She also did a H. pylori test through her GP because of the nausea that she was experiencing. And also she did suffer sometimes with acid reflux, so I wanted to rule that out. And I also had her do a complete blood panel through her GP as well. So the first test to come back were through the GP. She, as you can see, she was anemic, mainly represented by the deficiency in iron and low normal B12, folate and ferritin, so all three of them. This was obviously quite significant in relation to her experience of depression, as being anemic means less oxygen is being delivered to cells, organs and tissues, and the brain is highly oxygen dependent, and so any drops in oxygen availability will manifest in cognitive symptoms very quickly. As you can see, she was also quite severely vitamin D3 deficient, which was unsurprising considering her West African heritage. And of course, this is also very significant in relation to her mental health, as we know that vitamin D plays a role in activating the enzyme that converts tryptophan into serotonin, so that's in the brain, so that's tryptophan hydroxylase. Vitamin D also regulates the release of neuronal growth factors in the brain, which are important for neuronal survival and neuroplasticity. So it plays many important roles in the brain. I obviously suspected that she was deficient in these nutrients, not only because of her diet, but also potential issues with maldigestion, which the GI effects help to elucidate and we'll be going through. In terms of the, as you can see, H. pylori was also negative, which was, I guess, positive. I know that some tests might not be as reliable as others, however, so it was still at the back of my mind that could she have had it and the test didn't provide a reliable result. I don't know, but at least we did the test and it was negative through her GP. In terms of the recommendations, her GP prescribed a high doses of the vitamin D3, so she had the 20,000 IU twice a week for 6 weeks. I recommended her a high dose B complex, and I also wanted to hold off on the iron supplementation, which would, her GP actually prescribed her iron, the ferrous sulfate, but I said to her it would be best to wait a little bit for the GI effects because, as I'm sure many of you know, iron can feed pathogens in the GI tract in the gut. So I wanted to just make sure that there wasn't anything there first before considering the iron supplementation. So instead of that, we focused on obviously good quality sources of red meat as increasing her iron. So after a few weeks, we got her GI effects results, and you'll see over the next few slides the main points results that I want to turn your attention to. So I'm just going to highlight the most significant details. So here we're seeing the section on digestion and absorption and the markers associated to this. As you can see, she has good levels of pancreatic elastase, which I was surprised about, as most people who suffer with depression or anxiety will often also have suppressed pancreatic elastase, as it can be massively impacted by stress levels. She also had healthy levels of products of protein breakdown, which are byproducts of protein fermentation in the colon, and so therefore would indicate protein malabsorption in the upper GI tract if they were elevated, but as you can see, her levels are good. So this is one of the markers that we would normally associate with SIBO quite significantly, but as you can see, her levels were okay. The fecal fats, however, as you can see, moderately elevated, and the various lipid analytes below that, as you can see, there are some elevations there. Now, triglycerides and cholesterol make up most, if not all, of the dietary fat intake, and as you can see, they are both normal. We'd often see triglycerides high when there is more of a picture of maldigestion and therefore potentially an insufficiency of bile salts. However, with long-chain fatty acids, the situation is a little different. The long-chain fatty acids are normally passively absorbed through the gut wall, and so when they are high, we may be assuming that there might be issues such as SIBO, which can cause an acidic environment in the small intestine, and therefore an impairment of small intestine digestive enzymes. Another issue can be bile acid deconjugation, often as a result of methane-producing organisms in the small intestine. So these are the types of things that were going through my head, despite the fact that there weren't, significant elevations here, just moderate elevations. So the picture wasn't terrible, but I was just looking and trying to draw conclusions based on her symptoms. The phospholipid analyte also offers another valuable insight, as the majority of the fecal phospholipid pool is unlikely to come from diet and is more likely to come from shed epithelial cells and malabsorption of bile. So another thing to mention is that phosphatidylcholine, which is one of the major phospholipids, accounts for 90% of intestinal mucus. So elevations can also give you an insight into high mucosal cell turnover. So as you can see, the phospholipids analyte is the one analyte that is actually above reference range. So the majority of the malabsorption picture is coming from here, as well as slightly from the long chain fatty acids. And I believe, this could also be a pointer towards their propensity towards nausea. So my line of thinking at this point was that there could be some significant methane dysbiosis in the small intestine that could be driving these issues, considering her constipation. We know that methane is causally linked to a slowed gastrointestinal motility, and transit time can be slowed down by up to 60%. And this is as a result of the direct action of methane on the cholinergic pathway of the enteric nervous system. So on the GI effects, whilst we can't confirm methane dysbiosis, the only test that can actually confirm that is a SIBO test. There are some ways in which we can measure the likelihood of methane dysbiosis. So we offer this methane dysbiosis score, which is an algorithmically generated score that's driven by various factors in the test. As you can see, her score was only moderately elevated. Looking through her test results, I could see why that could be the case. So the first thing is that her Methanobrevibacter smithii was actually normal. As you can see, the grey shaded portion of that quintile distribution, it represents the percentage of the reference population that had below detectable levels. And so there's quite a significant percentage, about 75%. So it's normal to have those levels where they are. The other factors that drive that methane dysbiosis score are also fats, malabsorption or maldigestion, so high fecal fats. The reason being, as I mentioned before, with methane dysbiosis in the small intestine, what can happen is there can be this bile deconjugation and therefore a malabsorption of fats. The other thing that can drive the methane dysbiosis score is also a suppression of intestinal immunity. So we know that methane lowers postprandial serotonin, which most of us know as an important agent for motility. However, serotonin also plays an important role in intestinal immunity. It's a mediator of intestinal immunity. So essentially what methane does is it lowers serotonin and therefore suppresses intestinal immunity. So that's why we tend to see lower levels of secretory IgA. And as a result of that, we often also see a higher presence of opportunistic organisms. So with that in mind, we'll see, what else is contributing to that slight elevated level of 7. But something else I just wanted to also highlight was that whilst her methanobrevi was normal, certain Bacteroides species can also produce methane gas. And whilst we don't have PCR probes for the specific methane producing organisms in the Bacteroides phylum, if the overall phyla group is high, we may assume that others might be too. We also know that there are some hydrogen-producing organisms in the Bacteroides phylum, specifically in the Doribacter species, and methane-producing organisms consume hydrogen to produce methane. So they're just some sort of conclusions or assumptions, should I say, that I was drawing from these test results at this point. So just moving on quickly to the next point of the GI effects. Her culture analysis detected Klebsiella oxytoca, which is a gram-negative organism, and it has strong virulence factors such as LPS production. LPS are able to translocate across the intestinal epithelium and also, of course, enter into systemic circulation. Relating that back to her clinical symptoms of depression, we know that LPS translocation is a massive risk factor for brain health, and that's because it can cross the blood-brain barrier and also trigger, as a result of that, chronic neuroinflammation through the upregulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and that causes an overexcitation of the brain and then neuronal loss. So some key sort of links there. Klebsiella may also be a histamine producer. We know that other Klebsiella strains are, and considering her issues with the urticaria, I imagine that this could be having an influence. And as you can see, her immune system is responding to the Klebsiella. You can see that her secretory IgA is elevated. So the serotonin, or should I say the methane, isn't necessarily having a massive impact here. As you can see, she is having this response to the Klebsiella oxytoca. The secretory IgA, so the strongest indicator, or should I say the strongest driver of an elevated secretory IgA, is pathogenic invasion of the mucosal layer, which suggests to me that the Klebsiella was influencing this. We also know that in those with disrupted mucosal membranes, there's often a loss of the function of the enzymes responsible for degrading histamine, such as the diamine oxidase. So this could be another reason why she may be struggling with histamine-related issues. The Klebsiella overgrowth is also associated with a high intake of starch, which is unsurprising considering her diet up until now. So I then had to do a SIBO test based on these, because I wasn't absolutely sure based on these results. There obviously are some patterns that are coming up of potential SIBO, and in conjunction to that, obviously her symptoms. So I wanted to make sure of that. And as you can see, her SIBO test came back as methane positive. So just as a sort of brief insight into the criteria of methane positivity in the SIBO test, it's important to mention that methane can be problematic at any point in the GI tract and isn't just limited to the small intestine. So if there is a rise beyond 10 parts per million at any point in the SIBO test, small intestine or large intestine, that's regarded as a methane positive result. Hydrogen is different, however. It's only positive, or it only is a positive result if there is a rise beyond 20 parts per million up until S5, which is the small intestine. We actually expect to see hydrogen in the large intestine, as that's where the majority of fermentation is supposed to be occurring. As you can see, her hydrogen is normal here, but we know that in methane overgrowth there can also be sometimes an underlying hydrogen issue as well, because of the fact that methane producing organisms consume hydrogen to produce methane. So they can contribute to keeping the hydrogen concentration low, which would inhibit fermentation activity. So my initial recommendations based on should I say my second recommendations, because at this point we're already in a second consultation. I had her go on a SIBO dietary protocol and also histamine-free diet for 4 to 6 weeks. So had her avoiding the fermentable carbohydrates, histamine-rich foods, and histamine liberators. By this point, she'd already sort of gotten comfortable on, changing her diet to be healthier, more protein-rich, more fiber-rich, less high in sugars, obviously. So I was hoping that this wasn't going to push her too far. Of course, you know, I offered her the antimicrobials that are indicated for methane dominant SIBO. So I use the ADP oregano, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, as well as the Alimed for 4 weeks. And then in addition to that, I also offered her a prokinetic on an empty stomach twice a day to help with motility. This contained B6, potassium, ginger, deglycerinated licorice, 5-HTP, and curcumin. So I should probably note that, of course, the 5-HTP is a contraindication for sertraline. So because she was only taking sertraline a few days a week, and the half-life is more or less 26 hours, she only took the prokinetic on the days that she wasn't taking the sertraline. I also recommended zinc carnosine to help support mucous membrane repair, obviously repair of damaged epithelial cells, etc. And also some digestive support and extra mucosal support within the same product. So it was a glandular pancreatin oxbile concentrate, pepsin, HCl, glutamine. So of course, you know, just going back to the GI effects, she didn't have any notable issues of things like pancreatic elastase or HCl, etc. But I wanted to give her the full support, you know, just to help ease symptoms as much as possible. We also know that gastric secretions like HCl, pancreatic enzymes, bile, they all have bacteriostatic properties, which means that it actually helps to inhibit SIBO from occurring. So I wanted to offer her the full gamut of support, basically. And then in addition to that, I had her on Espelade. Espelade, as I'm sure many of you know, has the ability to adhere to harmful bacteria and gently remove them from the body, and also helps to support mucosal barrier immunity. So I thought that would be useful for her. So we had a review a few weeks later after she finished the antimicrobials. The nausea had thankfully significantly reduced. However, she still did experience it occasionally. Her bowel movements had also improved in that they weren't pellet-like anymore, but during her nausea reoccurrence, which she sometimes got, she would again get pellet-like movements. Really great that she was also able to come off of the sertraline since she'd started the SIBO, so she actually decided to try not taking it at all with the okay with her, you know, physician. And she, you know, had 4 weeks had been fine, hadn't noticed any difference at all, hadn't noticed any withdrawal symptoms or any need to take the sertraline. She was also able to come off of the fexofenadine after starting the SIBO protocol and histamine-free diet. She mentioned that normally after 2 weeks of not taking, she would start to itch, but she had actually been fine. So this is all really positive. She hated the diet. So this is one of the things that was quite difficult with her, is that of course the diet wasn't a long-term thing, but because she'd already made some significant changes to her diet, it was an extra push. She felt it was very restrictive and found breakfast particularly difficult. She was used to, you know, the typical Western breakfast where you had cornflakes, toast, etc. Periods still unfortunately painful. She was, however, able to go to work where previously she hadn't been able to. And then lastly, still a lot of stress from work, which, as you know, is always going to be a massive, massive mediator for any health condition. So we did the SIBO test 8 weeks later. Unfortunately, she was still methane positive, but as you can see, the patterns are very different. So if you will recall a few slides prior to this one, her methane was quite high in the small intestine. So I think I might just go very quickly back here, as well as hydrogen. As you can see, hydrogen was normal, but the methane, particularly it's S1, she was at, you can see here, she was at 14, 13, and then in the lower intestine, 15 and 25 and 21. So in the latest test, she had below 2, 3, 3, 2 in the small intestine, and had gone down to 9 where she previously had 25, and where she previously had 21, she had 17. So she was still positive, but just in that last reading, the S8 reading, where things significantly increased to 17. So there was still a little bit of work to be done here. So I had her go back on the antimicrobials for a further 3 weeks. She, in terms of the review as well, she was having bowel movements every day, but she did notice that if she didn't take the migrating motor complex support, she struggled more. So that was a prokinetic, by the way. Period still painful. I actually recommended at this point that she did the Dutch test, but because she'd already invested quite heavily in testing so far, her finances were quite tight. Work was a massive stress for her. Again, as I mentioned before, she was at this point in between contracts too, so that was the added stress as well. And then we started to reintroduce at this point also some histamine liberators, not the fermented foods just yet, and she was actually able to tolerate them, which is great. So we did the SIBO test again 6 weeks later, and as you can see, her methane had finally gone down to a normal level at a level of 7, which was great. That was after a further 3 weeks of antimicrobials, so it was a lot longer than I thought it had to be. In terms of the review, nausea 90% improved, which is great. The pain and cramps had gone. This only occurred though when she ate onion, garlic, or dairy or foods that were high in refined sugars. Also, her mood from the beginning, she felt a significant improvement. She felt more resilient as well, and of course, she was, for her, the biggest indicator was that she was able to come off of the sertraline completely and not have any significant issues coming off of that. We did a follow-up GP blood test, and as you can see, her iron was now normal. It was at 14, whereas before she was at 6. And this was not having taken any iron, by the way, because of the fact that she had the Klebsiella. I wasn't sure whether it was a good idea to supplement her with iron, so we just focused again on the dietary sources of iron, heme iron mostly. Her ferritin was now 42, whereas before it was at 81.1, and her vitamin D was now at 87 nmol per litre, whereas before she was at 15. So there were some key improvements there, and I hope also that the changes in her GI function, her digestive health, were also mediating the improvements in those levels there with the absorption. So ongoing, I did a few consultations with this lady, and I'm still in touch with her. It's been almost a year since I guess I started working with her at the beginning of this year, so it will be almost a year since I started working with her. I should note that SIBO unfortunately has a high rate of reoccurrence, especially methane dominant SIBO tends to be quite stubborn. So in terms of her GI symptoms, she's mostly okay, but she does need to be very careful still with the trigger foods. So those are things like the onions, for example, and garlic. Stress continues to be a huge hindrance on her recovery. So this is the thing that can always, set people back. So whilst she did improve some of the lifestyle stuff around stress, so improving her sleep hygiene and also exercise as well, it continues to be quite a huge interruption in her recovery. In terms of the maintenance supplements, the supplements she found to be most helpful were the prokinetic, the ginger and bitters, digestive support as well, so the gastric secretion support, so things like the pancreatin and the ox bile concentrate, etc. She found those to be of most help to her in terms of maintenance, and so she continues to take those to help mediate her symptoms, obviously mitigate, should I say, her symptoms. And yeah, since then there is some reoccurrence of the nausea still, unfortunately. It seems to be quite a complex thing that's occurring for her, and it's very difficult to understand the cause of that particular symptom, despite the fact that we managed to reduce it significantly, is still that 10%. And she really has to be careful, although she can get a reoccurrence. So in terms of the things that I've been thinking about, what could be causing that, what could be triggering, potentially structural abnormalities, any adhesions that could be mediating issues, such as reoccurring SIBO, cholestasis, so a lack of bile, potentially bile insufficiency, even though her GI effects showed that things were okay in that area. Again, it's just one test, so we don't have more than one test to look at, and we still have to question these things. So she is actually going to see a gastroenterologist to have a look into things like this at some point soon. I don't know what the results of that are yet, but I'm intrigued. And yeah, refer to gastroenterologist. So yeah, so that's the end of the case study. If you have any questions at all, please do write them in the question box in the control panel, and I'll have a look at them now and see what's going on. Let's see. Okay, questions. So I've got a question here on the relation between iron and gut pathogens. So yeah, so basically iron can essentially feed pathogens. So it's important to rule that out first before you consider iron supplementation. So it can make those sorts of dysbiotic pictures worse sometimes. So someone's asking if there are handouts for these slides. I will send the slides to you. So that will be sent to you after the presentation. So histamine liberators. So there are foods that can actually liberate histamine in the GI tract. So they're not necessarily histamine rich, but they can lead to a triggering of histamine liberation. And so they can also be, they can also contribute to histamine intolerance. Some of the foods are things like avocado, aubergine, tomatoes. So these are the types of foods that someone might need to also remove from their diet if they have any histamine-related issues. And yes, recordings are also available to you after the presentation. In terms of gluten, I initially didn't, that's a good question, I didn't put it in there. I initially didn't restrict gluten. So I just focused on really just decreasing the sugar in her diet and increasing protein, fiber, etc. I did have her come off of that when she did the SIBO protocol because the grains aren't allowed anyway. And so she does continue to be gluten-free now. I completely forgot to mention that. Apologies. But yes, I didn't have her test for gluten sensitivity. I didn't have her test for celiac, but that's something that I believe she may have tested at some point through her GP. But it could be a useful test to do for her for sure at some point. Someone's asking, in case of gluten restrictions, is it possible to use wheat bran? Unfortunately not. I think wheat bran still contains gluten, so that wouldn't be a useful thing. In terms of other things that you could use things like ground flax seeds. You can use also things like psyllium husk if you're wanting to add sort of fiber to things. Okay, just going through these questions. So someone's asking, would you look at liver function in this case? Yeah, definitely with the nausea. So as I mentioned in the last slide, what was going through my head was that despite the fact that her GI effects, the digestion and absorption section didn't mention any maldigestion necessarily, the triglycerides and the cholesterol were normal. They would be normally they would be high in relation to bile salt insufficiency. Because of the nausea, I'm thinking that there could be some sort of issue there, even though those markers were fine. So I did think, you know, cholestasis was one of the things that was going through my head. So that means literally an insufficiency of bile secretion in the small intestine, and what could be triggering that. I wasn't sure what could be mediating that, to be honest. There are things that can cause problems like that, you know, for example, viral infections can cause that, reactivating viruses. We didn't do any of that testing with her, so I'm not sure I could say that for sure, but yes, in a nutshell, I would, liver function is a key thing, and the gingers and bitters were quite useful in that sense, to help not only support the the liver, but also stimulate the bitter receptors so that that bile secretion would happen in a more easeful way, let's say. Also stimulating other gastric secretions too. Someone's asking whether the diamine oxidase, would the Klebsiella impact that? So it was, I suppose you could think of it in that way. So anything that is going to have a detrimental impact on the mucosal membrane is going to also have a negative impact on the histamine degrading enzymes like the DAO. And if Klebsiella is one of the things that's having a detrimental impact on the mucosal membrane, then yes, you could probably say that that could have an impact on those enzymes, and also therefore her ability to degrade and break down histamine. Someone's asking regarding iron. She increased hers by food alone and lowering SIBO, as I understand. How long did it take? So the iron, okay, so from the initial test until the test where we, did her bloods and saw that her iron was okay, I would say it probably took about 3 months, 2 to 3 months. The SIBO, also, let me think, we did 3 SIBO tests. So I would say maybe 2 to 3 months as well for the SIBO. Yeah. Someone's asking, as methane SIBO can be caused by slow bowel motility, would you check for hypermobility, or are people that have hypermobility prone to methane SIBO due to slow transit? So it's the methane producing organisms, okay, so methane reduces serotonin in the gut, and serotonin is the mediator of motility in the gut. So what comes first is the methane. That's what causes slow bowel motility. So I'm not sure I would be checking for hypermobility, maybe more in relation to someone that has the opposite end of the spectrum, so potentially diarrhea, although I'm not 100% sure about that. I know, I suppose if someone's hypermobile, they can have issues with motility in general in their gut. But it's the methane that's reducing the serotonin, and serotonin is what plays a role in motility. So I don't know that the hypermobility would make someone more prone to methane SIBO. I don't know. Have you considered HCl for stomach acidity to support occurring SIBO? Yes, definitely. That's why she's on that maintenance digestive support, which contains the HCl in there. So all of the gastric secretions, including HCl, have bacteriostatic properties. So they help to prevent SIBO from occurring. So they actually almost have like an antibacterial property to them. Prevent the overgrowth of SIBO in the small intestine, the overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, sorry. So yes, it would be great to use that in a way to also prevent the reoccurrence of SIBO as well. Also, the gingers and the bitters also stimulate HCl as well, so if that can be something else to also include. Can you recommend anything to improve bile flow secretions? Yeah, so again, the gingers and the bitters. So anything that stimulates the bitter receptors is going to help send that sort of neural signal to those organs, gallbladder specifically, obviously in this point, to release bile into the small intestine. That's the main thing. The other thing is I don't know if you've come across things like TUDCA, which is actually bile concentrate. So that's not necessarily going to stimulate her own production of bile necessarily. So in terms of that, the specific agents, are things like the bitters, for example, and the cholagogue herbs that help to stimulate the bitter receptors. Someone's asking if I can repeat the need for the S. boulardii. So the S. boulardii, what it can do is it can adhere to pathogens and help their removal from the GI tract gently. And S. boulardii can also support mucosal immunity, so it can actually help in that first line defense against pathogenic invasion. So that's why I had that in there for a couple of months. Someone is asking on my opinion using rifaximin for reoccurring SIBO, considering it isn't absorbed systemically. So I've never worked with a physician that could prescribe rifaximin, so I don't have any experience with rifaximin at all. All I know is that in my my education around SIBO is that rifaximin is very it's very effective. And also can get to the problem quicker than the natural agents. But I think in some of the studies, from what I remember, and don't quote me on this, but this is just from what I remember in my own research, is that the natural agents can be, in a longer period of time, just as effective as the rifaximin. But again, I've never used it because I don't work with a physician that prescribes rifaximin. Would giving bifidobacteria and lactobacillus be of any help? I wouldn't rule it out. I guess the reason why I didn't offer her any other probiotics is because I wanted to offer her more of the support around including the prebiotic fibers in her diet to help encourage sorry, the flourishment of sorry, certain organisms. But yes, there are certain strains that can help with this sort of presentation with constipation. I would highly recommend a website called Probiotic Advisor. I don't know if anyone's come across that, but it's it was founded, I believe, by Jason Horolak, who is one of the Dr. Jason Horolak, who's one of the I would say the spearheads in SIBO research. He's based in, I believe, Tanzania or something like that, or Australia. Probiotic Advisor, it's an annual subscription, and you can find the right strains that have research for specific clinical presentations and symptoms. And so for that, you can see methane dominant IBS or constipation dominant IBS is there as a condition, and you can see all the probiotics that are sort of useful for that, or others, for example, other conditions. If someone's asking if you can recommend S. boulardii with a probiotic, yeah, you can do. I don't see what the issue would be for that, no. Another question about what I would recommend for acid reflux. I guess it depends on what is triggering the acid reflux. So ruling out anything structural like a hernia, for example, first. Also ruling out H. pylori, which is one of the things that can trigger acid reflux. In terms of things, if it is just a matter of having low levels of stomach acid, the HCl and betaine can be useful. Zinc carnosine as well can be very useful. Obviously avoiding all of the trigger foods for the time being as well. So someone is asking if there are any markers in the stool test that you would be concerned of for colon cancer, other than referring a client to the doctors. Are there any tests or markers you would use if blood in the stool and there is a concern of colon cancer due to family history? Yeah, so I guess one of the markers that would be indicative of a high inflammatory status would be the calprotectin, which is a marker of neutrophilic inflammation, or yeah, so that the calprotectin is often high in relation to IBD, but can also be high in relation to colon cancer as well. Often you get the calprotectin concurrently high with the eosinophil protein X, which is another marker of inflammation that we offer in the GI effect stool profile. It's a marker of IgE-mediated inflammation, so can also be high in relation to other things like food allergies or protozoan infections. But particularly with the colon cancer, you will often see calprotectin high, and in concurrently with that, the EPX, the eosinophil protein X. Any other questions at all? I've got just a few more minutes. Okay, I think we'll leave it there in that case. So thank you everyone for your time and participation. Again, I'll send the slides and also the recording to you as soon as that's ready, either today or tomorrow. So keep your eyes peeled for the case study presentations that we've got coming up next year. We've got a really good lineup coming from January all the way into the summer. So please do sign up and have a lovely Christmas. And if I don't speak to any of you, I wish you all the best and Happy New Year.